CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Paul Barber. Our top stories. China's President Xi Jinping meets with his Russian counterpart after calling for friendship, cooperation and peace.
UBS punished by investors for coming to the rescue of Credit Suisse in a deal designed to avert a global banking crisis.
An emergency cash infusion. 6 central banks announced plans to keep dollars flowing through the world's financial systems.
And act now or it's too late. UN scientists deliver their final warning on climate change, saying drastic action is needed to save our world.
China's President Xi Jinping has met with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Moscow.
Putin praised China for what he said was its objective and fair stance in dealing with international affairs related to Russia. He also said Moscow respects China's stance on Ukraine and that Russia has studied a 12-point plan put forward by China aimed at resolving the conflict. President Xi said the partnership between the two nations could safeguard a just and fair international order, as well as promote the prosperity of both countries.
Our correspondent Yang Chengxi is in Moscow with more.
President Xi arrives in Moscow at around 1 p.m. local time, and he was welcomed by a delegation of senior Russian officials led by Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Chernyshchenko when he stepped out of the plane. A welcoming ceremony was held there with the Russian military band playing both national anthems. President Xi Jinping inspected the honor guard of the 3 services and watched the march past. President Xi also made a written remark at the airport. He said China and Russia are friendly neighbors, and he hopes to have in-depth discussions with his counterpart Vladimir Putin on the bilateral ties and major international and regional issues of shared interest. President Xi also met with President Putin in the Kremlin just now, and tomorrow he will have a full day of talks and expected deal signings on a range of issues tomorrow. Now, as we know, the two presidents are meeting against the backdrop of the conflict in Ukraine, and what we don't know is to what extent the conflict will be discussed. China recently put forward a 12-point peace plan for Ukraine, and in a call to reporters earlier today, the Kremlin spokesperson said the two leaders would discuss the themes of that peace plan together. Now, there's been no confirmation from China's side, but there was an interesting remark from China's foreign ministry earlier today. Now, spokesperson Wang Wenbin saying President Xi's visit will be a trip to foster peace. He also said China will continue to uphold its objectives on the issue of Ukraine and play a constructive role in promoting peace talks. China's recent role in brokering a diplomatic deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran has led many observers to wonder if it can make a similar breakthrough in Ukraine. Now, neither side has spoken about that possibility. Most of what we know about the discussions suggests they will likely focus heavily on trade, cooperation, and forging stronger ties.
So what else can we expect from President Xi's visit? I've been speaking to Jeffrey Sachs, renowned economist and professor at Columbia University.
It's extremely significant. The China-Russia relationship is very important, not only for the two countries, but is very important for the questions of war and peace, for the possibilities of ending the Ukraine war, for the reshaping of global politics. So this is an extremely important and very fascinating meeting that's taking place.
Thinking of the peace deal brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia as well as this visit, why is China taking a more visible role in trying to mediate?
Well, I think it's a very responsible role. China is trying to end conflicts. China has a very large presence in all manner, economically, financially, technologically, diplomatically, around the world, and China has put forward proposals for peacefully resolving some of the really long-standing and dangerous conflicts. So I applaud China's efforts. I applaud any efforts towards peace, and I oppose all efforts towards escalating the ongoing conflicts.
And China has maintained its neutrality in the war in Ukraine. How does this visit fit into that?
China has put forward a peace framework that I think is a very productive and promising one. Basically, China has said from the start that this war needs to end at the negotiating table, that there is a diplomatic solution possible, and that the diplomatic solution must recognize the legitimate security interests of all parties. And to my mind, the basis of peace in Ukraine is for the United States to make clear that NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine and to Georgia, putting Russia's security at risk by the advance of a U.S. military alliance, and at the same time, Russia will stop the war and return home. And this has been the basis for avoiding the war beforehand, and it's the basis for ending this war. And I think China understands that there are deep security interests that need to be respected on all sides for this war to end, but that's absolutely feasible to do. Unfortunately, the United States has pushed the NATO enlargement agenda so aggressively, so repeatedly, so much without any insight into how the others view this, that it has really evaded negotiation up to this point.
In other news, stock markets remain jittery after the takeover of the bank Credit Suisse.
UBS Group agreed to buy Switzerland's second biggest lender for over $3 billion on Sunday, but will assume up to $5.4 billion in losses. Britain's central bank, the Bank of England, says UK institutions are safe, while Germany insists its financial system remains robust and stable.
Our correspondent Trent Murray is in Berlin. Trent, the European Central Bank also weighing in. What's it had to say about resilience in the banking sector?
Yeah, that's right, Paul. Christine Lagarde, the president of the ECB, very keen to send a strong message that this we're not calling it a bailout, it's a bail-in in many ways by UBS, that this deal which has been struck is good for Europe and will restore orderly market conditions and ensure financial stability. Let's take a step back in all of this. This has been an extraordinary 6 days for Europe's banking sector. Credit Suisse really teetering on the edge now for several days, which is why we saw this deal hastily arranged over the weekend. The Swiss regulators and the government getting Credit Suisse and UBS into the same room, effectively asking UBS to try and buy out its smaller, long-time rival. This, in many ways, is a marriage of convenience, a forced marriage, if you will. Neither side wanted it, but there was really no other way out. The Swiss authorities say that they really were staring down the barrel of Credit Suisse collapsing in an uncontrolled way. And, of course, that could have had a major domino effect on financial markets at a time when things are already quite jittery, as you say, in the wake of what happened in America with Silicon Valley Bank. So the two sides coming together, UBS will acquire all of Credit Suisse's assets. It will bring to an end Credit Suisse trading as an independent bank, which is extraordinary. It has been around for 167 years. It really has been a pillar of global finance for a long time, but it has not been able to escape controversy and negative headlines and accusations of bad investments. And for that reason, they will no longer exist in an independent sense. We still don't know whether the brand will continue. Many questions over all of that. But what the Swiss finance minister is saying, that they had to act, they had to do this because the consequences could have been catastrophic. Let's have a listen to what Karen Keller-Sutter had to say.
The bankruptcy of a global systematically important bank would have caused irreparable economic turmoil in Switzerland and throughout the world. For this reason, Switzerland had to take the responsibilities beyond its own borders. These efforts have paid off. The Federal Council is convinced that UBS takeover of Credit Suisse has laid the foundations for greater stability both in Switzerland and internationally.
Now, look, we've heard really a chorus, I suppose, of congratulations from around the world in some ways. We've had the Germans and the French straight out of the gates today saying they support this deal, but also that their banks are very stable. The Americans also saying the same thing. And this is about effectively trying to send a message of confidence to the market and to avoid any risk at all of what's known as contagion. In other words, this issue or uncertainty with bank liquidity spreading to other financial institutions. That is not what governments and regulators want to happen. And it seems that that message may be starting to get through to investors, at least today. When markets opened, Paul, in Europe this morning, they were sharply down. I just had a look before coming on air. Both the DAX and the CAC in France closed in the green, I should say. UBS as well, very interesting. They opened 16% lower, sharply down. Their shareholders clearly were cautious about the deal that had been almost hoisted on them, but they too have closed in the green, up about 3%. So I think investors starting to digest all of this as the dust settles, but still many questions and details that we are trying to get answers for, including job losses. Credit Suisse employs 50,000 people, including 16,000 in Switzerland alone. We know a number of those roles will now become redundant, given that they have effectively been acquired. We will just have to wait and see where those job losses will be hit. Many people saying it will likely be in the investment banking arm, particularly in Asia, where there is some crossover between the two companies.
OK, Trent, many thanks for that update. Trent Murray in Berlin.
Let's take a closer look now at how Europe's major indices have reacted to that deal, UBS taking over Credit Suisse. And as Trent was saying there, very different picture at the end of the day to what we were seeing at the beginning of the day here in Europe. The Swiss Stock Exchange ending the day up around just over 0.5%. In Germany, the DAX up strongly, more than 1%, and in London, the FTSE 100 also up just over 1%. So let's talk now to Octavio Morenzi, who's the CEO of Opimas, a management consultancy focused on global capital markets. Welcome to the programme. So this buyout deal designed to calm nerves, restore confidence. Has it done that, do you think?
Well, it seems to be working so far, but I think this is a deal that's going to face a lot of legal challenges and indeed a lot of political challenges as well. I think this is going to be a deal, a transaction that's going to be very deeply unpopular amongst the Swiss public, who are likely to turn against it at some stage in the not-too-distant future. So I don't think we're anywhere near out of the woods yet on these deals. A bunch of the bondholders of Credit Suisse are very unhappy because they've been wiped out. The equity holders are very unhappy because basically the Swiss government has taken their property away and give it to UBS at much, much lower than market rate was just on Friday afternoon. So we're going to see a lot of challenges on this. I don't think this is a done deal yet.
So plenty of people unhappy then, including initially the markets, which saw a sell-off on the back of this. What did they see that they didn't like?
Well, I think we've basically seen the Credit Suisse equity holders, the shareholders, more or less wiped out. So they've had to take a huge haircut on their holdings. Also, we've seen some of the bondholders of Credit Suisse wiped out as well and basically driven down to zero on a certain type of bond that Credit Suisse had issued. Now, that's an unusual way to go about doing things, to favour the equity holders over the bondholders, but that is what the Swiss regulator did. So there's a lot in this that is to be very unhappy about. If you're an investor in banks, basically you're looking at very, very steep losses. Even if the depositors within Credit Suisse are made whole and everyone is able to get their money on the deposit side, the equity holders are basically looking at very, very steep losses here. And in particular, the Saudi National Bank that had put in $1.5 billion not so long ago.
So this new bank, assuming it all goes ahead, will be made up of UBS and Credit Suisse. What do you think it will look like? What will stay and what could go?
Well, first of all, I think the most interesting part of Credit Suisse is probably its Swiss banking operation and its wealth management. And their UBS and Credit Suisse have a very, very large overlap in terms of geographic coverage, in terms of where their branches are within Switzerland. So I would expect a lot of those things to disappear. So a lot of those job losses will be focused around that. There'll be very substantial losses, I think, in the investment banking arm of Credit Suisse, where I suspect that UBS, though they don't know this yet because they just acquired the thing. Basically, they bought themselves a black box. They're not entirely sure what's inside it, and that's why they had to get these very substantial guarantees from the Swiss government. But they're going to have to take that apart. But I suspect the investment banking arm of Credit Suisse is basically going to be shut down. There might be some areas where Credit Suisse is stronger than UBS, and they'll retain those. But I would expect to see substantial job losses within the investment banking arm of Credit Suisse, especially in New York and in Asia. So we're going to see some tying down there of the resources and unwinding of the positions there.
OK, Octavio Marinzi from Apimas, good to talk to you today. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme.
Thank you.
To keep in touch with the news from China and our correspondents around Europe, you can go to the Telegram app on your phone and search for CGTN Europe. Follow the channel to get updates sent to you directly, as well as pictures, features and interviews that explain the events driving the news agenda.
You're watching Global Business Europe. Still to come, we'll tell you why investors in one particular sector have a smile on their face.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliette Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe.
Well, let's get more now on the takeover of Credit Suisse. It's been a bumpy day on the stock markets, with investors worldwide trying to digest the implications of that buyout by UBS. Our correspondent, John Terrett, is in New York for us. So, John, it's all a bit nerve-wracking, isn't it? What's the international reaction been like?
Well, you know, it really is. But I have to tell you, at the moment, as of this minute, things seem to be turning a bit of a corner here. And maybe, just maybe, this deal was the right way to go. We'll see. We call it on Wall Street a shotgun wedding, you know, when two people are forced to get married because something embarrassing has happened or might be about to happen. Well, that's the way Wall Street's looking at this. And for us, it was the second Sunday in a row that we've been interrupted. People were busy watching sport at home, and they had to keep flicking back and forth between sport and the press conference going on yesterday in Switzerland as the bank revealed what it was going to do. Now, of course, it was historic, no question about that, but it also immediately raised concerns here on Wall Street. For example, in no particular order, the bank's value slashed in 2 days from $7 billion down to $3 billion. The Saudis getting a major haircut, which I think the Swiss rather enjoyed, actually, because, of course, it was the Saudis that started all of this at the back end of last week when they said they wouldn't give Credit Suisse any more money. The greater problem, though, is this $17 billion worth of bonds, which have basically been turned to zero. Now, they call them Tier 1 debt. That has really unsettled the bond market, or it did yesterday. It really unsettled the bond market. We didn't know what was going to happen in the bond market until it got trading in Asia and then latterly in Europe. That could have been a big problem. It doesn't seem to be, but we're in early days at the moment. And then there's this issue about was it a bailout or not? Well, Wall Street says, of course it was a bailout. Of course it was. And the reason for that is that there's $100 billion of liquidity being pumped in by the Swiss National Bank to backstop this deal that UBS has done. And on top of that, there's another $9 billion worth of Swiss government money for possible losses in the future, of which UBS will absorb the first $5 billion, like an insurance policy. So what did that do to shares? Well, here in New York, where these companies trade as what they call ADRs, Credit Suisse was down about 60%, and it still is. It's down 55% now. But UBS was down 13% here on Wall Street, and now it is up by 3%. And that's why I say there's a sign, I think, that maybe, just maybe, people around the world are looking at this deal and saying, OK, it's not perfect, but you know what? It probably was the right way to go. I think if it all goes well for UBS, they've got an incredible bargain on their hands. And, of course, we're not dealing with any toxic assets this time round like we were in 2008. Then things had been sold and parceled up and packaged around the world. Nobody knew where they were. This banking crisis seems, at least at the moment, things could change, but at the moment, to be something that bankers can and governments can at least sort out. So a little optimism at the moment, and for that reason the Dow is presently up about 260 points. Paul and Robin.
So, John, good to have a bit of optimism there. This is a wider story, though, isn't it? What's lurking around the corner?
Yes.
What happens next?
Well, it is a wider story for us because the other side of this banking worry at the moment is the regional banking crisis here in America, which began with last week. It was SVB, remember that Silicon Valley bank that went over. Now, the story of the weekend is First Republic, another regional bank, and that made history last week when $30 billion was pumped in by a rescue coalition of 11 of the big banks here on Wall Street. But then Friday night, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, beginning with the Times, began reporting that First Republic would still need more money. And it dawned on everybody that it will still have to compete in this very uncertain world that we're in at the moment. So right now, First Republic shares are down 29%, and they've been halted a couple of times this morning, and they're down more than 40% in just the last week. So SVB, that began all of this, that was downgraded over the weekend by Credit Suisse. That'll make things, not Credit Suisse, by Standard & Poor's, and that's going to make life even harder for them. And then a tiny bit of good news, Signature Bank, the other bank that fell over last week, has just been bought by New York Community Bank, whose shares are up 31% now. They will turn Signature Bank into their Flagstar banking brand. But here's the problem, you see, Paul and Robin, because what's happening is people who have money in regional banks, like the ones we've just been talking about, are phoning up their brokers and saying, should I transfer my money to the big Wall Street banks? And the brokers are saying, well, if you want to, you can. And the people are saying, well, how much will it cost me to do that? And the answer is nothing. And so, therefore, they are. And there, I think, tells you a lot. I think we may have more regional banks, of which there are thousands in America, by the way, getting into difficulty in the weeks to come. Now it's all eyes on Wednesday, the Federal Reserve. Will it raise interest rates by 25 basis points, or will it do nothing? We have to wait and see.
Well, we'll certainly have you back to tell us all about that on Wednesday. Finally, John, what's going on with Bitcoin? Why has that been soaring?
Well, I mean, how ironic is this? I mean, just how absolutely... Well, we were writing off Bitcoin a couple of weeks ago and saying it was going to go down to 10,000 and then it might bounce up to 15 if you were lucky and all that kind of stuff. And remember, about a year ago, it was one Bitcoin was worth more than $60,000, and it came all the way down to the sort of low double digits there. Well, what's happened is people don't trust the banks anymore, apparently, and so they're investing in Bitcoin. Extraordinary, isn't it? So Bitcoin rose 34% between a week ago last Saturday, that was the 11th, and last Friday, the 17th. And other Bitcoin products are benefiting as well. And right now, Bitcoin this morning was back above 28,000. Remember, a week ago, it was hovering around 10 or 12 or something like that. So now 28,000. And it is down at this minute. It's 27,900. But, you know, you've got to go back to June of last year to find anything as good as that. Paul and Robin.
John Terrett in New York, thank you very much indeed.
Amazon is laying off another 9,000 workers. It's on top of other cuts in recent months, which have affected more than 18,000 employees. The company says it wants to streamline costs to help it navigate an uncertain future. The latest layoffs mainly affect cloud computing, human resources, advertising and Twitch streaming businesses.
The new boss of Starbucks has begun work 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Laxman Narasimhan takes over the reins of the coffee giant in time for an annual shareholder meeting on Thursday. He succeeds interim boss Howard Schultz, who's due to give evidence to a Senate panel looking into claims that unions have been suppressed at the company.
The International Monetary Fund is set to finalise a bailout deal with Sri Lanka worth $2.9 billion. The country's economic crisis led to huge demonstrations and the takeover of the presidential palace last year. The IMF has welcomed what it says is progress by the government as it moves to combat corruption and reform labour laws.
Over a month after two earthquakes devastated Turkey and northern Syria, aid associations and donors are meeting in Brussels to look at delivering long-term help to the affected areas. The
United Nations has launched an appeal to raise over $1 billion to support the millions of people left homeless. Well, our correspondent Alex Cadier is in Brussels for us. So, Alex, what's been going on at the conference?
Well, Robin, I was hoping to be able to give you that final number. We've had a few hours now of pledging from a variety of different countries. We know that all members of the G20, with the exception of Russia, were invited to this donors' conference to raise money, as you said, for Turkey and Syria. And I was hoping that in the last few minutes we would have heard. But I just saw the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen walk past, so she's going towards her press conference. We'll get a sense of how much has been pledged today. It really has been a global show of support. We heard from the United States and Canada and North America. We've heard from Japan and South Korea, in Asia, and as well as Gulf states and a lot of European member states, as you'd expect. Now, there's a real push for, or at least certainly from the Turkish government, to make sure that these recovery efforts, these rebuilding efforts, are front and centre, that enough money is being pledged. Well, we've seen big money being pledged by the European Bank for Recovery and Development. They've pledged over $1 billion. The European Commission getting out front saying we will pledge another €1 billion, that's just over $1 billion, for Turkey, and €108 million for Syria. Now, that support will be a little bit different for Turkey and for Syria. Turkey will see money for humanitarian aid, yes, but also for reconstructions, what's been described as rebuilding schools and buildings and houses for people who lost so much in that tragedy, and making sure that public institutions can keep running smoothly for the future. Syria, however, will only receive humanitarian aid and early response support, not the full reconstruction, for fear that either the Syrian regime or opposition in the north of the country will misuse those funds, and there's not enough accountability there. So that will link possibly to some criticism of the EU for not having enough thorough and rapid support for Syria. But the final number, when we have it, will likely be a big show of support coordinated by the European Union here in Brussels for Turkey and Syria, which we'll have in the next few minutes.
Alex, thank you very much. That's our correspondent, Alex Cadier, in Brussels.
The World Health Organization has labelled the massive earthquakes that struck Turkey and Syria in February the worst natural disaster in 100 years in the European region. Over 46,000 people died in Turkey alone, while thousands of buildings were completely destroyed.
But alongside the human toll, the disaster has also had a major impact on the economy. Our correspondent, Mikhail Bardavid, reports.
The two massive earthquakes that hit 10 provinces in southeastern Turkey on February 6 left behind devastating destruction.
IOM has counted the number of displaced people at 2.7 million, which is around 20% of the region's entire population. And we have a new update on the number of destroyed buildings, which is 214,000, with more than 600,000 independent apartments and offices contained in those buildings. So the needs are vast, but the resources are scarce.
The World Bank estimates the direct damage in Turkey at around $34.2 billion, adding that the total reconstruction and recovery costs would likely be twice as high. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, has announced it will invest up to €1.5 billion in the next 2 years to support the country's recovery. The earthquakes hit Turkey at a time when its economy was already struggling. Last year, the lira lost about 30% of its value and inflation soared. While the economy grew by 5.2% in 2022, rebuilding after the earthquakes is expected to hamper growth. The earthquake-hit regions are crucial for Turkey's manufacturing industries. Damaged factories and a loss of workforce have disrupted supply and production chains, significantly impacting the country's manufacturing sector.
11 cities in the earthquake zone produce approximately 10% of the gross national product for the Turkish industry, and it is a region with very important cities for our sector. When we consider this in terms of our own sector, particularly the raw material part that we call yarn and fabric, which is a textile part, that region holds a 30% capacity in our sector within Turkey.
Experts in the textile industry say a lack of schools available for children in quake-hit areas is driving a significant migration and are calling on the government to take action.
When we look at past earthquakes in the region, around 30 to 35% of the population have permanently migrated from those areas. This means that if someone has the opportunity to work elsewhere and has the necessary skills, they will take their child and move. Therefore, we need to give them hope that they will be provided with both education and housing as soon as possible.
Though Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has pledged to rebuild homes in 1 year, experts warn it will likely take years for the region to fully recover. Michal Bardavid, CGTN, Istanbul.
Well, many people left homeless by those earthquakes continue to live in fear of aftershocks. Many are struggling to adapt to living in tents as their homes lie in ruins. Our correspondent Zara Aldersi reports.
With a few alternatives to what he can call a home, Mohammed Aslan has been living in a tent for the past month after the devastating earthquake robbed him of his home. He struggles to get by day after day with daily necessities such as food, water, and products for basic hygiene a scarce resource. But what Mohammed and many other survivors of the earthquake struggle with the most is fear. Fear that the earthquakes will strike again and that what little they have will be taken away. Fear of what the future holds. Fear that life will never be the same again.
We lived on the top floor, but the building was incomplete. Our home was damaged in the earthquake. The rooms have cracked walls and they're no longer suitable to live in. Now we have no alternative but to live in a tent. We're getting over our trauma from the earthquake, but now we worry about safety. We can't sleep because the tents have no doors. They're always open and there's no security or privacy.
Meanwhile, Abdelmonem Najm chose to stay in his house despite the damage brought on by the earthquake.
When the earthquake hit, the whole house cracked from top to bottom. There are cracks in the walls of the kitchen and other rooms. We're afraid the walls will fall on us. When the big earthquake happened, the wall almost exploded.
Ahmed Juma, who has been displaced from his home in Mardat and Oman, has found shelter in the Mulham village in Azaz. The village was established by the Mulham volunteer team to house those displaced from the border between Syria and Turkey.
When the earthquake happened, we couldn't understand what was going on. When it stopped, I came here to the Mulham village with the little things I have left. But there were some administrative problems at first. After the village administrators realized that my wife had just given birth, they gave us a good house to live in.
In Syria alone, the earthquake has taken over 5,000 lives, while millions more suffer from its impact, with the humanitarian aid still trickling in as a result of the existing conflict and economic crisis that has already been plaguing the country. Zahra Derzi, CGTN, Northwestern Syria.
You're watching CGTN, still ahead. 20 years after the US-led invasion of Iraq, we look at the British political backing for military action, despite widespread public anger.
Roger, Ricky, loud, clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh,
we hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Paul Barber and Robin Dwyer. The headlines again. China's President Xi Jinping meets with his Russian counterpart after calling for friendship, cooperation and peace.
UBS punished by investors for coming to the rescue of Credit Suisse in a deal designed to avert a global banking crisis.
And an emergency cash infusion. 6 central banks announced plans to keep dollars flowing through the world's financial systems.
Well, Iraq is marking 20 years since the beginning of the US-led ground offensive that launched 8 years of war and led to the downfall of then-President Saddam Hussein.
Associated Press correspondent Philip Crowther has more from Baghdad.
Well, the very basic conclusion here, and what people will tell you here, not just experts in the matter, is that Iran now has more power here in Iraq, and there's a reason for that. A Sunni minority that was in power during the regime of Saddam Hussein lost its power, thereby giving power to Shiites, and they are, of course, the ones that are making access to Iraq easier for Iran. Iran is represented here through politicians, but also through militias on the ground. There are other ways that the US invasion of Iraq 20 years ago has an impact here in this country, but further afield as well. Here, the presence of US troops, well, that led to the emergence of an insurgency and to the emergence of al-Qaeda here in Iraq. And later on, when US troops left, well, they only left for a short while, coming back to fight the new terrorist group. That was the Islamic State group, which, of course, does not only have a presence here in Iraq, but in Syria as well. And that is also the reason why there are still US troops here right now. There are 2,500 around 2,500 US troops here. They are here to train Iraqi soldiers in their fight against the Islamic State organization, and they don't seem to be going away anytime soon. So the US presence is still felt here in Iraq, as is the presence of a NATO mission that is here as well. But they are invisible. You will not see US soldiers or NATO soldiers on the ground here in Iraq, with one notable exception. That's in the north of the country, in Kurdistan.
That was Philip Crowther in Baghdad. Well, the UK was a key ally of the United States in the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
But the decision by then Prime Minister Tony Blair was met with widespread opposition, not just by large sections of the British public, but also by families of some of the soldiers.
20 years on, our correspondent Shamim Chowdhury has been finding out why so many are still angry.
Corporal Stephen Albert was killed by friendly fire near the southern city of Basra just days into the Iraq War. A 2007 inquest found he died due to negligence by the British Army. His widow Debbie spent the next 14 years seeking justice.
The Defence Secretary at the time claimed national security, which meant that I couldn't take it any further. I couldn't get it into our court, which is what I wanted. Because there was no appeals procedure or anything like that. I was just absolutely heartbroken. I was angry. I felt that I hadn't achieved all my goals that I wanted to do, because I promised Steve that I would get justice and make sure it wouldn't happen again. And it was just stopped in an instant.
Debbie is among several families of British soldiers who took legal action against the army. They not only objected to the treatment of troops, but to the war itself. Their views were shared by millions across the country. Hundreds of thousands of people protested Britain's involvement in Iraq. But Prime Minister Tony Blair remained resolute.
This is not the time to falter. This is the time for this House, not just this government or indeed this Prime Minister, but for this House to give a lead. To show that we will stand up for what we know to be right.
Some even demanded he be tried for war crimes, accusing him of letting British soldiers and Iraqi civilians die in vain.
This memorial honours the 179 British soldiers who lost their lives in Iraq. But the human casualties aren't the only price of war. The 8-year conflict cost the UK nearly $12 billion, paid for by British taxpayers.
In 2016, an official investigation into the war, known as the Chilcot Inquiry, found that Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein did not pose a threat to Britain at the time of the invasion, and that evidence of him possessing weapons of mass destruction was not conclusive. Tony Blair rejected the criticism of his decision, and while he apologised for mistakes, he continued to justify the invasion, saying removing Saddam from power had been the right thing to do. But for Debbie's two young sons, Joshua and Connor, the war has meant growing up without a father.
They had a lot of problems. They were behind at school. They had a lot of anger issues. They were privy to information that they shouldn't have been privy to.
Just a few of the tens of thousands of British lives impacted by the country's involvement in Iraq. Shamim Chowdhury, CGTN, London.
The decision to support the invasion of Iraq caused huge divisions in the UK's ruling Labour Party. Claire Short was a cabinet minister at the time who voiced opposition to the war. She ended up resigning and ultimately leaving the party. She's been sharing her memories of that time with Jamie Owen.
I remember the Iraq war is a terrible mistake, and that the government, Tony Blair really individually, only got people's support by being untruthful about why he was doing it and whether there was WMD and what had happened at the UN. There was even dishonesty about that, pretending that they had UN authority when they didn't. So lies, breaches of international law, terrible destruction, brought shame on the government, diminished its reputation, alienated me from my party. The only thing to do now is learn lessons and try and bring peace and development to the people of Iraq who've suffered terribly.
And that was Claire Short speaking with Jamie Owen. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Can Emmanuel Macron's government survive 2 no-confidence motions amid the anger over pension reforms? We're live in Paris.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
And welcome back. The United Nations has issued its starkest warning yet of the urgent need to cut fossil fuel usage to avoid catastrophic climate change. Scientists from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have released their latest report, which concludes that governments are not doing enough to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. That's the cut-off that scientists say is necessary to ensure a livable future for humanity. The UN says solutions are available, but that more political will is needed.
The 1.5 degree limit is achievable, but it will take a quantum leap in climate action. This report is a clarion call to massively fast-track climate efforts by every country and every sector and on every time frame. In short, our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once.
Dr. Ajay Gambhir is a senior research fellow at Imperial College London's Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment. And he joins us now live. Thank you very much indeed for being on the programme. What stood out to you about this latest updated report, and how worried should we be?
I had a look through the report this morning, and
it was very stark. It's using language which I think is unequivocal in terms of how grave it is and how serious the threat of climate change now is. It says that climate change is being felt across the world, and so that really stood out. It's that it's here, it's with us now, and there is no option now but, as you heard from that clip, act really, really quickly and across all parts of the world.
So there really is no hiding from reality. The experts saying that it is likely that this 1.5 degree ceiling likely to be breached in the 2030s. This report saying that we do have the tools available, but there's a lack of political will. Why is that the case?
Well, people often say to scientists, why are you so calm about this? And, you know, why aren't you shouting this and screaming this from the rooftops? I think that the language that you're seeing in the report, and actually the clip that we just heard, is this is scientists basically screaming from the rooftops, look, there is no time left. You know, we have something like 10 years, perhaps a little bit less than that, till we breach this 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. And that doesn't suddenly mean that things start going wrong, but that's a really important threshold. We're already seeing, you know, extreme weather events at 1.1 degrees Celsius above what we call pre-industrial levels. So 1.5 degrees, even if we limit global warming to that, is going to be worse than what we're experiencing now. So you're right, there is nowhere to hide. This is scientists basically screaming and saying, let's get on with it.
And you mentioned these really extreme weather events. This report really noting the scientific link between rising emissions and extreme weather. These changes only projected to keep getting worse with global warming. Is there anything that governments and businesses and citizens like us can do right now?
Absolutely. Look, we've seen encouraging announcements from governments and businesses across the world. They've announced something called net zero targets, often around mid-century. And that means getting emissions down to zero, or if there are any other emissions, then offsetting them with removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And those targets are encouraging because if we follow those plans, then that gives us something of a hope of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. At the moment, however, they are still words and they are still just paper plans. And yes, we are seeing some encouraging signs like the rollout of electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar panels, renewables, in many cases replacing coal and gas power. But we just need to see that at much greater scales and with much greater urgency. And it's when we start seeing policies and business decisions and consumer decisions on the ground really starting to kickstart this that we'll know that we're getting on track towards something that's in line with 1.5 degrees.
Yep, so now really time for action. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Ajay Gambhir from Imperial College London, for your time this evening. Thank you.
With microplastics filling our oceans, we're all being encouraged to recycle whatever we can. But how countries process recycled materials varies greatly. In Brazil, just 4% of all domestic refuse is recycled. And even that is down to a huge army of waste sorters, most of whom are women. Our correspondent Lucrecia Franco reports.
Maria do Carmo Oliveira, or Carminha she likes to be called, is a proud waste picker entrepreneur. Now the 67-year-old is the president of an all-female rubbish collecting cooperative in Rio de Janeiro.
We were invisible workers, but today things have changed for the better and we see ourselves as environmental agents.
Carminha runs the Cop Quitungo cooperative, which has been hired to handle all the recyclable waste at events such as this food festival in the city's famous Copacabana neighborhood.
It is a strong message we want to share with all bar and restaurant owners in Rio so they can adopt responsible recycling. It is the right thing to do in these times of crisis.
Mass collection of plastic, paper, glass and metal at events like this one is a win-win model for both businesses and recyclers. According to the latest official data, waste pickers are responsible for 90% of all recycling in Brazil. Here at the food festival, the cooperative has set up recycling points, like this one, to separate all the reusable materials that can be sold. Far away from Copacabana, in Rio's poorer north zone, is the Cop Quitungo cooperative. Here, Carminha and her team finish sorting the waste. It is hard work, but their main source of income, as it is for 70% of the country's estimated 800,000 pickers, who are women, according to Brazil's national movement of recycled material. The women, most of them head of their families, earn the equivalent of some $300 per month, more than the country's monthly minimum wage of $250. Money they can count on by selling recyclable goods to scrap merchants.
I was a cleaning lady during the day and would comb the streets at night to pick up rubbish to feed my family. Now I have a safer full-time job because I'm paid to recycle. I'm very happy.
There is still a long way to go, but by partnering with big events and other public and private companies, these women say they feel empowered and valued while standing up for the environment. Lucrecia Franco, CGTN, Rio de Janeiro.
French lawmakers are debating separate no-confidence motions in the government after last week's decision to force through controversial pension reforms without a vote. President Emmanuel Macron wants to raise the retirement age to 64, a move that sparked weeks of protests. If the no-confidence votes succeed, he'd be forced to either appoint a new government or call fresh elections.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent Ross Cullen, who's in Paris. So, Ross, are we going to see these motions pass? And what will that mean for President Macron's pension reforms?
Hi, Robin. It's likely the pension reform motions of no confidence will fail. At the moment, looking at the tallies of MPs, you need 287 MPs to vote for your motion of no confidence in order to get it through. And it seems that we have around 267 MPs who have so far said that they want the government to fall. They need another 20, and they need them potentially to come from the Republican centre-right party, the Conservatives, the former party of Nicolas Sarkozy and Jacques Chirac, previous presidents, but the party, their stock really has fallen in recent elections. They have far fewer MPs than the far-right party, National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen, one of the former leaders of the far-right, and she has also put forward a motion of no confidence. We have one from her and one from the cross-party group known by the LIOT. If either of these pass, then the government would fall. Elizabeth Bourne would have to be replaced as Prime Minister, although many people think that she could well be replaced even if the government wins this vote. The government would fall, you'd have to change Prime Minister, and you could even have snap elections. But the last time there were legislative elections, Emmanuel Macron's party Renaissance saw its number fall by more than 100. And so it's likely that they could get an even more damaging results if Emmanuel Macron dares to hold early elections. But at the moment, at the tallies, it looks unlikely that these motions of no confidence will succeed, and so the government would not fall.
Well, we're looking at live pictures as those debates continue. There have already been many protests and strikes over these planned pension reforms, of course. What's next?
Yeah, ongoing strikes at the moment. The latest that we have sectors walking out, holding industrial action today, Monday, include transport workers, refinery workers, rubbish collection workers. There are still stinking piles of garbage on many streets in different towns and cities, including Rennes in Brittany and here in the French capital. The main day of a general strike is going to be this Thursday, the 23rd of March, for the 9th such day of general strikes and protests across the country, mass mobilisation, the unions calling for a unified day of action to force the government to try to scrap the reform it just passed. But it did so, as Paul was mentioning in the introduction, in a controversial but constitutional way, by forcing the reform through Parliament without allowing MPs to have a vote in it. MPs will have a vote in the coming hours on those motions of no confidence. They did not get a chance to vote for the pensions legislation, which was forced through Parliament by the government.
Ross, thank you very much for that. That's our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris.
Israeli opposition parties will file a Supreme Court challenge against government legislation to curb judicial powers. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has signalled that the plan will be softened, an apparent bid to calm more than 2 months of nationwide protests. US President Joe Biden spoke to Netanyahu at the weekend, urging him to seek compromise.
The King of Thailand has dissolved Parliament, clearing the way for elections in May. The vote will pit the ruling party of current Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha against the daughter of exiled former leader Thaksin Shinawatra. Prayut, who trails in opinion polls, led the military takeover against Shinawatra through a Thai party in 2014.
Residents in the Australian town of Menindee want authorities to begin the clean-up after hundreds of thousands of dead fish were found floating in the nearby Darling River. Low levels of oxygen in Australia's second longest river are to blame for the mass fish die-off in a remote part of New South Wales state. Police say that an emergency operations centre is being set up to coordinate the disposal of the decomposing fish and to organise the supply of clean water.
The world's longest metro line is now open in Moscow, built with the help of Chinese engineers, and their influence can be seen at one of the line's new stations. Our correspondent Alyosha Milenkovic reports.
A brand new building in red, with huge white letters saying Michurinsky Prospect, hides one of Moscow's latest metro stations. It is Saturday, so there are not too many people inside these new and wide halls. But regardless, this metro station on the outskirts of Moscow is still very vibrant.
Out of over 250 metro stations in Moscow, this is the most unique one. Its design is clearly influenced by Chinese culture, which is not surprising since it was built by the Chinese CRCC. The ornaments here represent a Chinese letter for friendship, which is an appropriate symbol for the current state of affairs between China and Russia.
Michurinskaya metro station was officially opened by Russian President Vladimir Putin on March 1st. That event marked the opening of the world's longest metro line, the Large Circle Line. Depending on how you calculate its length, it's between 57.5 and 77 kilometers long, and it serves parts of the capital that previously had no metro line access.
Ежедневно большой кольцевой линией пользуется 1 миллион человек.
1 million people use the Large Circle Line each day. By the end of this year, we expect that number to rise to 1.3 million. And in 2025, the passenger load will increase to 2.3 million people per day.
Moscow's metro system is the largest and most developed in the world. Chinese participation in this project was both groundbreaking and beneficial for both sides.
We have several specialised projects to build railways and roads in very difficult and demanding terrain in Siberia and the Far East. And this Large Circle Line in Moscow is a good example of that collaboration.
The plan is for the Moscow Metro to continue to develop and evolve as the city expands further. And Chinese participation is also likely to increase following the positive response to the Michurinskaya metro station. Alyosha Milenkovic, CGTN, Moscow.
Finally, Spain's famous Las Fallas festival, which welcomes the beginning of spring, has finished with a bang. Fireworks and huge bonfires marked the end of the 5-day festival in the city of Valencia. As part of the celebrations, giant papier-mâché sculptures are thrown into the flames. One sculpture, though, is always spared, and this year it was an installation representing a mother taking care of her sick daughter.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
Coming up next, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again, though, tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team in London, bye-bye.
Goodbye.